Hello crafty friends, I'm Lynn from Studio Kato and I'm so glad you're joining me again today. Today I'll be making a cute little card with some products from my favorite things, and I'll be doing an emboss resist technique on the background. I'm starting out by stamping all my images onto a scrap piece of cardstock. I'm using the Canson Montval 200 GSM watercolor paper because I will be coloring these in with my Caron brush markers. To do some watercoloring, I'm inking the stamps up with Versafine Onyx black ink, and then I'm embossing them with Wow Clear Gloss Superfine embossing powder. For the background, I cut a panel of the same paper, Canson Montval 200 GSM, and I die cut that with the Wonky stitched rectangles by My Favorite Things. I'm using an older MFT stamp here. This is the Hearts Entwined stamp, and I'm stamping that in Versamark ink onto my watercolor paper. I'm stamping it twice and stamping it firmly because the watercolor paper has texture to it. And I embossed that image with Wow Bright White embossing powder. Now I'm using the Concord and 9th inks to do some ink smooshing. These are my absolute favorite inks to do this with. I like to do ink smooshing with dye inks, which these are, because it really looks like watercolor. It dyes the paper in exactly the same way that watercolor would. Unlike oxide inks, which sit on the paper and have a more chalky look. Now, dye inks are usually very water reactive, so you can't really layer them like you would with oxide inks, because any water or wet ink that you put on top of a previous layer will reactivate the previous layer and just make them all blend together. Now, for some reason, and I don't exactly know why, the Concord and 9th inks, when they are dry, when you smush them down and you heat set them or you let them dry, you can't really reactivate them with water. Now, they are transparent. They're not pigment inks, they are dye inks, they aren't opaque, so that means that when you layer them on top of each other, while they won't reactivate the first layer, you will still see the color of the first layer through the second layer. But this means that when you have drying spots and drying streaks in the first layer, you can still see them even if you put another color on top of it. So you get more color variation and more streaks and splotches. It looks more fun than it would if you just used any old dye ink. As you've seen, I am using just a plastic sheet to bring the color to the paper. This just gives me more control over where I put my color down. I can really see where I'm putting the ink, and that helps to make sure I have all the hearts covered and I don't just color the whole thing. To finish up this background, I am adding some splatter using some of the same inks I've used before, and if you're curious about all the colors I've used here, you can find all of those listed in the description box below. In between each layer, I have dried this with my heat tool, and that's really important if you're doing ink smooshing and want to build up color. I'm trying not to go too heavy-handed with the splatter because I didn't want to cover my whole panel. And I don't think I've actually mentioned this in my emboss resist video, but because we embossed that image, the embossing will resist any wet medium you put on top of it. That's why the image is showing through the watercolor, or the ink in this case. Now I'm coloring all these images in with my Caron brush markers. I'm doing this first part in real time, so you can see how slow or how fast I color, and I will speed it up after doing this flower. I'm using a couple of different pinks for the flowers, and I just put the color down with a marker in the areas I want darkest, and then I blend that out with a fine paintbrush and some clean water. I'm using pink for the flowers. I'm using 3 different pink markers in total, but the variation in color is very slight. I chose pink because I wanted to do the gnome in orange, and I think pink and orange is a great combination. People often wonder how you choose colors for a card, and honestly, I just choose the first color that comes to mind, the color I feel like using, and I build off of that. So today I was in the mood for some blues and greens in my background, maybe just because I love the blues and greens in the Concord and 9 things. And orange is a wonderful contrast with green, so that's why I wanted to do the gnome in orange. If you're using a contrasting color for the focal point and for the background, that means your focal image will stand out nicely. I'm keeping the coloring really simple for all the images. I will put some extra effort into the gnome image itself. I've mentioned it before, but when I have some different types of leaves or greenery to color for a card, I always use different types of green. This adds more interest to the entire piece. These Caron brush markers are so fun to color with. I think they're also a really great place to start for beginners if you're looking into getting into watercoloring, although the price point of these is definitely higher than a regular watercolor palette. They do make watercoloring really easy, but the selection of colors is of course more limited than you would have in a panel because you're more likely to mix your own colors when you're working with a palette. But these are definitely a very fun alternative. Now I first colored in the shoes in orange, but I changed my mind later and I'm going to layer on some brown as well. Now one weak point of the Caron brush markers is definitely all the gray markers. They just don't blend as well as all the other colors. So to help that along, I first paint in the beard with some clean water and then drop in the marker. This makes it easier to blend it out nicely. I told you I was going to put some more effort into the gnome image, so I am adding some shading, some extra shading with a darker orange marker. And what I love about these MFT stems is that they're not very small, so they make for a great focal image on a card where you don't have to add too much to it. And the size of these really makes them easy to color as well. You don't have to pay too close attention to super tiny details. Now once I'm happy with them, I will let them dry completely and fussy cut them out. I'm using a sentiment from the Springbird stamp set, also by My Favorite Things, and I'm stamping that in Versamark ink onto some bright green cardstock. I will emboss this in Wow Bright White embossing powder. To add a little detail, I wanted to add a black and white striped pattern paper, but I didn't have that, so I just cut a strip of black cardstock and I covered that in sketchy stripes with my white gel pen. As always, once I have most of my pieces done, I just play around with them and arrange them on the card. I'm using the smallest flower in the middle of the card, because that way there's a nice flow from the outside to the inside of the card. Cut some strips from black cardstock to layer behind the little banners I cut and add some dimension. You can add this with foam tape or foam squares, but I choose to do it with extra cardstock that I have laying around. The biggest rectangle from the Wonky Stitched Rectangles die set that I used is still slightly smaller than an A2 size note card, so I added some color to my note card, just the edges of it, to use as a matting layer. I swiped the ink cube directly over the paper because that always gives the most intense result. To put this card together, I added some dimension behind my panel with more white cardstock, and then I'm adding everything on top with liquid glue, apart from the gnome, which I'm adding with some foam squares. This always takes the longest, adding the foam squares and peeling the backings off, but I think the dimension is worth it. Overall, this card took me an hour to make, so not too long. And once I add that gnome to my card, I'm almost done. I'm just going to add some embellishments as well. I'm using the metallic silver pearls from Pinkfresh Studios, and I'm just adding a couple of them around my focal image. I'm using a jewel picker to make this easy, and I'm adhering them with my Barely Arts Precision Craft Glue. And that finishes up the card, and I'm just going to make a quick matching envelope. I'm following the directions for an A2 sized envelope on my VR Memory Keepers 123 punch board, and I'm making that envelope out of the same bright green cardstock that I used for the sentiment strip. To add a little extra, I am doing some tone-on-tone stamping using a green ink from Concord and 9th. I think this is the Parsley ink, and I'm stamping on some of the flowers from the stamp set. I can then just glue my envelope together, and then this card and envelope are all done. I really like how this card turned out. A lot of bright fun colors and just a pop of black beneath the sentiment strip. I hope you liked the video. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. You can find all the supplies I used, as well as a link to my Instagram and my blog, in the description box. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.